So today we are going to look at the different structures of the organelles inside the cell, and we will look at their functions. So the first organelle we're going to look at is called the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm is the environment inside the plasma membrane. Okay, so inside of the cell, and it's a semi-fluid. In prokaryotic cells, this is where everything takes place. So all of the chemical processes, such as breaking down sugar to generate energy, all take place in the cytoplasm. Okay, so here's our prokaryotic cell. Just this lightly blue shaded area. All of this is the cytoplasm. In eukaryotic cells, cells perform these processes within their own organelles. Okay. But those organelles do not float freely in the cell. Instead, they're going to be found and bound to the cytoplasm. So in the eukaryotic cell, all this light orange, this is the cytoplasm. And then very similarly related to the cytoplasm is the cytoskeleton. So the cell and its organelles are going to be supported by the cytoskeleton. So our formal definition is like the network of long, thin protein fibers that form a network of support for the cell, and they provide anchors for organelles. But think of the word skeleton. Your skeleton, or all the bones in your body, they provide you structure and support, and the cytoskeleton provides that for the cell. When we look at the cytoskeleton, we can look at two different substructures. The first one is called a microtubule. So micro means tiny, and tubule, think of like a tube. Okay, so these are very small, but they're long, hollow protein cylinders, and they just form a rigid skeleton for the cell, and they help assist in moving substances within the cell. So the microtubule, it's down here. It's just these like long, skinny tubes that help move things within the cell. Our second substructure is called a microfilament. Okay. So these are just little protein threads, and they just help give the cell shape, and they can enable either the entire cell or parts of the cell to move. So these are our microfilaments. And both these two features, they can rapidly assemble and disassemble and slide past one another, and that's how they actually allow cells and the organelles to move. So now we're going to look at eukaryotic cells. So these are the cells that have all of the different organelles. And these organelles make it possible for different chemical processes to take place in the cell at the exact same time. So some of these essential processes that can happen are protein synthesis. Synthesis is just another word for making. Let's say make. So making proteins, energy transformation, digestion of food, excretion of wastes, and cell division. So each organelle within the cell, they each have their own unique structure and their own unique function that are all going to contribute to some of these main functions. So now we're going to go through those individual organelles, and we'll go through their structures and their functions. The first organelle we're going to talk about is called the nucleus. So the nucleus is the cell's managing structure. Okay, so think of it as like, this is the brain of the cell. So it's what tells everything what to do. And it stores most of the cell's DNA. Okay, so that's the information that provides like instructions for protein production or for cell growth, for function, and for reproduction. Okay, so again, it's like the brains. It tells everything else what to do. So this whole feature here is the nucleus. And so the nucleus has some different parts to it. We're going to talk about just a couple of them. So first of all, we're going to talk about the nuclear envelope. So this is just a double membrane on the outside of the nucleus. It is very similar to the plasma membrane, except the holes here, they're much larger than they are in the plasma membrane. So that allows larger substances to move in and out of the nucleus, such as chromatin. So chromatin, it's the complex DNA that attaches to proteins, and then that gets spread out throughout the nucleus. Okay, so this is the chromatin. The next organelle that I want to talk about is called a ribosome. So ribosomes' main purpose is to manufacture proteins, okay, or to make proteins. So make sure that you know that. So ribosomes make proteins, and they're made up of two components. So ribosomes are made up of RNA and proteins. Something unique about the ribosome is that it's not bound by a membrane like all of the other organelles. And ribosomes can be found in multiple locations throughout the cell. So ribosomes, they can either float freely in the cytoplasm. So like these like pink dots, you could think of those as ribosomes in the cytoplasm. And then they can also be bound to a different organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum, which is right here. So the ribosomes that are free floating, so like these pink circles here, their main like purpose is going to produce proteins for use within the cytoplasm. Okay, so they're going to help just make proteins that get used within this cell. The ribosomes that are bound to the Golgi apparatus, they are going to help produce proteins that will be used within membranes in the cell, or they can be transported out of the cell and be used by other cells. And then finally, ribosomes, they get produced in the nucleus in a special place called the nucleolus, and that's where ribosomes are produced. So the big ideas that you need to know about ribosomes, though, are that they help manufacture proteins. That's the absolute like most important thing you need to know, and that they're made up of RNA and proteins. Next is an organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum. And that's kind of a mouthful, right? Endoplasmic reticulum. So for short, it's just called the ER. Okay, so ER for short. And so the endoplasmic reticulum, it's just a membrane system that has a lot of folded sacs and interconnected channels. And it serves as the site for protein and lipid synthesis. All right, so I even bolded and underlined. So that's the important part of the endoplasmic reticulum. So protein and lipid synthesis. And remember, synthesis just means making. Okay, so they make proteins and they make lipids. If you look at like the structure, you can see all these folds. So by allowing this organelle to have all these folds, that is a lot of surface area. And so that surface area is where some of these cellular functions take place. So it's a very efficient structure. And there are two types of endoplasmic reticulums. One is called a rough endoplasmic reticulum. This is where ribosomes are attached to it. And these produce proteins that are going to be exported to other cells. So if you look at this, this is a rough ER, or a rough endoplasmic reticulum. And if you can see all these little yellow dots here, those are the ribosomes. So that's why it's called rough. And then know that these make proteins that are going to go to other cells. The second type of endoplasmic reticulum is called a smooth ER. So there are going to be no ribosomes on this organelle. And this one is going to be in charge of complex carbohydrate and lipid synthesis. Okay, or they're going to make complex carbs and lipids. This is also where phospholipids are synthesized. The smooth ER in the liver is what helps detox harmful substances from your body. The next organelle we're going to talk about is something called the Golgi Apparatus. So this one's just a flattened stack of membranes that modifies, sorts, and packages proteins into little sacs called vesicles. All right, so they're going to modify, sort, and package proteins. Okay, so that's like the big one to remember. If you can remember into little sacs called vesicles, that is even better. So vesicles can fuse with cells in the plasma membrane, and they release proteins to the environment outside of the cell. Okay, so this is how we produce like proteins or carbs that need to be used elsewhere. So you can think of the vesicle, it's like a transportation system. So here something might get made into the Golgi, and it's eventually going to make it outside of the cell and into the external environment. Next, we're going to talk about an organelle called a vacuole. So a vacuole, it's just a large like sac. I guess it doesn't have to be large. Most of the time they're large. And it's used to store food, enzymes, and other materials to be used by the cell. Some of them can store waste. And this is the first time we're going to distinguish between a plant and an animal cell. So far we've just been talking about eukaryotes in general. We can now separate eukaryotic cells into two different categories. So I might write that up here. So eukaryotic cells can be separated into plant cells and animal cells. So vacuoles are mainly going to be found inside plant cells. Typically, animal cells don't have vacuoles, and if they do, they are very small and much, much smaller than a plant cell's vacuole. So then here is just like a computer-generated image of a plant cell. So look how huge this vacuole is. And this is like an actual electron microscope image of a plant cell with the vacuole. Okay, so in these plant cells, they're very large. Next is an organelle called a lysosome. So lysosomes are vesicles that contain substances that digest excess or worn out organelles and food particles. Okay, so these are neat little organelles. They can also digest bacteria and viruses that enter your cells. And they can fuse with vacuoles, and they can dispense enzymes to digest waste. So they're like the big garbage gut of the cell, if you will. Next is an organelle called a centriole. So centrioles are just groups of microtubules, and they just function during the process of cell division. And these are located in the cytoplasm of animal cells and most protists. Okay, and they're typically found near the nucleus. So here is the example of a cell. So here are the centrioles. This is the nucleus. Okay. So they're pretty close to the nucleus here. Here's just a blown up of the centriole. So each of these little blue structures is the microtubule. So it's just a bunch of those microtubules put together. Okay, next is mitochondria. Mitochondria is easily memorized by everyone as the powerhouse of the cell. So this is where the energy comes from. So they make the energy so they convert fuel particles, mainly sugars, into usable energy. So in the mitochondria, the bonds that hold sugars together have energy stored inside of them. And so those bonds are broken, and it releases that energy to be used. So that is how we get our energy. So the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Next is an organelle called a chloroplast. These are specific to plant cells. And so these just capture light and they convert it into chemical energy through a process called photosynthesis. All right, so if we look at this image right here, so this is our computer-generated picture of a plant cell. So here are the chloroplasts. And then this next picture is like the blown up picture of a chloroplast. Okay, so this is the chloroplast. Inside is something called the thylakoid, which is also right here, so it's just blown up. So in the thylakoid is where you would find something called chlorophyll, and that is just what that is where energy from the sun is going to be trapped. Chlorophyll is also responsible for giving like leaves and stems their green color. And chloroplasts, they belong to a group of plant organelles called plastids. So plastids, they have a variety of different functions, but some are used for storage, so some store like starch or lipids. And they also contain something called chromoplasts. These contain like the red and the orange and the yellow pigments. These two trap light energy. And then these are what provide color for different like flowers and plant structures. While we're on the topic of plant-only organelles, it's a good time to mention something called the cell wall. So the cell wall, it's specific to plant cells. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a wall around the cell. So it is just this thick, rigid mesh of fibers that surrounds the outside of the plasma membrane. And its function is pretty similar to the function you would think of as a regular wall. So it's going to provide support for the cell, and it's going to protect the cell from the outside environment. The cell wall is going to be made up of a carbohydrate called cellulose, and that's what makes the cell wall so inflexible, okay, or it's so rigid. If you were to take like a nice fresh flower and you were to bend it in half, that flower is probably going to actually snap in half and break, right? So they are not flexible, and that is due to the cellulose in the cell wall. The next two structures I want to talk about are called cilia and flagella. So both of these are going to be used for cell movement. Okay, so cilia, they are just like short little projections that look like a lot of little hairs. Okay, so these are going to be composed of microtubules. So here are like the cilia in my computer generated image. Here's the cilia from an electron microscope that have, of course, like had color added. And you can think of the movement of cilia of like rowing a boat. So kind of think like how you would move oars if you're rowing a boat. They work in a similar way to help move the cell. The second type of structure is called a flagella. These are longer and way less numerous than cilia. So if you look here, there's a lot of cilia. This is just one flagella, and it kind of got cut off, but you can think it's just like one long tail. Here's an electron microscope image, so this one has a couple flagella. And these are going to move in like a whip-like motion. Okay, so that's what's going to help the cell move if they have a flagella. And then these are going to be made up of microtubules also. And again, both of these are going to be used for cell movement. So when you think of cilia and flagella, think of helping the cell move. All right, so finally, I just want you to think about comparing cells. So how are they different? So we can break up cells in multiple different categories. So we can break them up into prokaryotic cells, and we can break them up into eukaryotic cells. And then from there, eukaryotic cells can be broken up into plant cells and animal cells. And so all of these different types of cells, they do share some similarities and some differences. So now what I want you to do is I want you to think about these different cells. Okay, so this cell here is a plant cell. This is an animal cell. And this is a prokaryotic cell. So I want you to go back and look through our organelles. And I want you to see what organelle do they all share in common, and then how do they differ? So what are some differing organelles between the prokaryotic cell, the animal cell, and the plant cell? So feel free to go through your notes, take some notes on this. You can make a list and be ready to discuss this in class the next time we meet.